In the last episode, we talked about systems of belief and the ways that the different sides of the Taiping Civil War represented different ideologies and perhaps tried to compel ordinary people to support their side by appealing to particular ideologies or belief systems or religious ideas. Looking at these different belief systems and perspectives is a common way to analyze the Taiping Civil War, and it's often just an interesting way to look at history, especially when you have these different clashing types of civilizations that are meeting for the first time. Especially in this case with this brand new Taiping religion interacting with ancient cultures in China or Europe. So analyzing systems of belief in a conflict like this is nice, but I also think that it potentially misses what ordinary people may have been dealing with as far as the practical realities on the ground, especially with a conflict like the Taiping Civil War, where the violence, the brutality, and the atrocities were really unprecedented in a lot of ways. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here. Historian Stephen Platt talks about what happened to the city of Hangzhou when, in 1860, the Taiping army, led by one of its commanders, known as the Loyal King, decided to invade Hangzhou. Quote, "Hell unleashed itself in the besieged city as its untrained militia defenders broke ranks and desperately looted the homes of their neighbors before running from the Loyal King's onslaught. The leaders of the civil government abandoned their offices, some leading their bodyguard detachments in ransacking the city's richest homes before making their escape as well, leaving no command in place whatsoever. As the Loyal King's small force fought its way through the breach in the city wall, local citizens did battle in the streets with the looters who were supposed to be defending them, compounding the war dead with the lynched, the mangled, and the burned. Fires raged. The city's women, following generations of moral instruction on how to behave in times of chaos, began putting themselves to death, tens of thousands of them by the end. Like other Confucian governments before it, the Qing dynasty had celebrated female suicide as the pinnacle of virtue, and it ramped up its honors for women's suicide in the course of the Civil War. Female suicide became a kind of perverse defensive measure against the rebels. Fearing rape and murder when the Taiping entered the city, the women of Hangzhou acted as they had been taught. They hanged themselves, poisoned themselves, stabbed themselves with knives, and threw themselves into wells to drown." End quote. Historian Stephen Platt goes on to say that the Taiping attack eventually stalls out. There's not really a strategic objective to accomplish there anyway, so they just leave the smoldering ruins of the city behind them. Meanwhile, a bigger Qing army gets word of this attack. Remember, communication is not instant at this time in history. So they come rushing down to defend the city. And then Stephen Platt picks up with what happened next, saying, quote, "When the relief troops finally arrived at Hangzhou after their forced march, they found no Taiping presence there. Nor, for that matter, could they find any semblance of a civil government. So, like the others before them, they just looted whatever was left." End quote. There is so much in that quote that I just read. First of all, the violence and the female suicides jump out at you, but it's also a great example of the nebulous, shifting nature of these towns and cities during this war getting totally run over by one side, only to have the other side come through later on and do the same thing. And this is actually something that was fairly common during this war. Just to recap, in this particular case, the Manchu militia is supposed to be defending the city against the Taiping. They realize they're going to have no chance against this army that's coming towards them, so they decide to loot the city and leave. The Taiping army gets there. They get to now loot and rape and pillage. They leave, and then the Qing army shows up and nobody's there. They're supposed to be the relief force, but they end up looting the city and leaving. And you have to imagine everyone fleeing this scene is probably looting and pillaging wherever they're going. So this particular story in Hangzhou illustrates the way that no matter what belief system or what perspective you may have believed or someone may have been trying to get you to believe, sometimes the situation just called for survival. If you're an ordinary person living through this war, you probably had good reason to be suspicious of everybody. If you're wondering what the looting of a city process looks like logistically at this time in history, you shouldn't be wondering for very long, because it's exactly what you might think. Literally, people just rolling through a city, doing whatever they want, grabbing whatever they want, and taking whatever they want. Here is historian Stephen Platt again describing a British officer and quoting from him as he's taking part in the looting of the Summer Palace in Beijing. So remember that while the Taiping and the Qing are brutally fighting each other, the British are nominally trying to remain neutral. And in this particular case, they're trying to get treaty rights reestablished with the Qing dynasty. And they basically sail all the way up to Beijing, looting the palace as they go. Stephen Platt says, quote, "A British officer recalled arriving at the Summer Palace that first day in the midst of the burgeoning free-for-all to find," quoting the officer, "some men quite off their heads with the excitement of looting a palace, and for no apparent reason, tearing down grand embroideries. I saw one man send the butt of his rifle through a huge mirror." End quote. Platt describes the officer seeing huge, giant vases, gold statues, jade carvings. And he quotes the officer as feeling like, quote, "a boy suddenly told to take what he likes in a pastry cook's shop," end quote. Also, apparently he was, quote, "puzzled where to begin," end quote. He then loaded up as much of the jade and gold as he could onto his horse and admonished others around him for not moving as quickly as he did. So the looting and the burning was not uncommon for any side of this conflict to be taking part in. In fact, ironically, as that British force was sailing to Beijing to loot the Qing, they were also taking part in some unsavory actions towards Taiping supporters who they felt like were getting a little bit too close to the port of Shanghai, which is where a lot of the business and the trade and the international commerce happened in China. A war correspondent for the North China Herald was there at this particular attack, this time led by the French, and he described French soldiers moving, quote, "frantically among the peaceful inhabitants of the place, murdering men, women, and children without the least discrimination. One man was stabbed right through as he was enjoying his opium pipe. A woman, who had just given birth to a child, was bayoneted without the faintest provocation. Women were ravished and houses plundered by these ruthless marauders without restraint." End quote. Another example of what we've been talking about, where these Western imperial powers are kind of doing whatever they feel like as far as maintaining their economic and trade interests. If that means looting the palace at Beijing in one instant while simultaneously attacking the Taiping near Shanghai, then that's what they're going to do. It's extremely complicated, and I think if you're interested in the chronology and the specific events and sort of the direct cause and effect of what seems like these just comedy of errors that the Western powers are stringing together here in China during the Taiping Civil War, I definitely recommend you check out Stephen Platt's book, Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom. But I do think I'm trying to make this larger point here that these Western powers are accidentally bumbling and stumbling their way into atrocities and messes that you could argue they themselves created. Now, there were some in Britain who were worried about the impact of Western interference in the Civil War, worried about the looting and the burning and the violence, but they were worried about it in terms of how all that would impact trade. British politician Earl Grey, summing up this perspective, saying, quote, "We must consider whether our great trade with China, a trade which directly and indirectly contributes more to our prosperity than that which we carry on with any other nation of the world, with the single exception of the United States, is likely to be promoted by burning the cities and slaughtering the inhabitants of that vast empire." End quote. So there you go. Ultimately, public opinion back home, coupled with the success of the British in, quote unquote, renegotiating those treaties with the Qing, as well as some of the Taiping stubbornness, ideologically speaking, and aggressiveness, particularly when it comes to Shanghai, led the British to, again, technically be neutral in the conflict, but by the end, if you had to say whose side were they helping more, it was probably the Qing. And that played a significant role in the outcome of the war. But ultimately, this was a Chinese civil war, and it was the armies of Zhang Guofan and the way that he used them that ultimately probably led to the final result of this war, which was a devastating destruction of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. After initially looking very strong in the stronghold of Nanjing, Hong Xiuquan and the Taiping armies eventually started to get worn down, and by 1862, 1863, the wheels started to come off. By 1864, a series of crushing defeats, civilian massacres, lack of food supply, disease, and starvation rampant across Taiping-controlled areas, power struggles and purges going on inside the city of Nanjing, often orchestrated by Hong Xiuquan himself, and the end was near for the Taiping. But again, as all of this is happening, the impact on the ordinary people of China, the refugees and the small folk, and the people that all of this violence is impacting is worth noting. I'm going to read a passage here from historian Jonathan Spence, who sums this idea up very well. Quote, "Grim as conditions are for the Taiping troops, their sufferings hardly compare with those of the masses of refugees and homeless villagers who wander in the area, displaced again and again by fighting that seems to have no end. These farmers and small-town dwellers of the Yangtze Delta have now to contend with at least 8 different kinds of troops who march and countermarch around their former homes. There are the Taiping field armies themselves, secret society or other irregular armies loosely affiliated with the Taiping, independent gangs of river pirates or land-based marauders, the local militias and peasant defenders of rural communities, the large Qing armies recruited by provincial leaders like Zhang Guofan and his brothers Qing regular forces commanded by the officials of the Jiangsu province, Western mercenaries hired by the Qing authorities and currently commanded by the American Frederick Ward, and regular military or naval forces commanded by the British. For more than a year now, foreigners and Chinese traveling the roads and creeks from Shanghai through Suzhou towards the Yangtze, or even to the walls of Nanjing itself, have grown almost accustomed to a range of somber sights. Across a 50-mile swath of land, one might see almost every house destroyed, wantonly burned by one side or the other, or stripped of its doors and roof beams. That wood then serves either as fuel for the troops or as makeshift supports for temporary bridges across the myriad canals and creeks, or to shore up the defensive ramparts of some short-lived garrison stockade, erected around villages where every man and boy has been pressed into service by one army or another, and the woman carried off, where, quoting one Chinese account now, human bones lie bleaching among cannonballs, end quote, and only the elderly are left to pick among the debris. And what is left of these communities, quoting that source again, quote, the houses are in ruins, streets are filled with filth, human bodies are left to decay in the open places or thrown into pools and cisterns there to rot, end quote. You could go on with accounts just like that one that depict the misery and the suffering of the ordinary people as a result of this war. But I think I'll close with historian Jonathan Spence describing what one Westerner found as he stumbled into a Chinese refugee camp in 1862. Spence describes the scene while quoting a little bit from that repulsed Westerner, saying, quote, the refugees are crammed into half a dozen bamboo huts off the road, all emaciated and wretched in appearance, and some dying of starvation and disease, lying on mud floors that flood with every rise in the tidal flow of the river. The living are mixed in with corpses in all stages of decay, sometimes blending life and death in one family scene, as in the case of one still living mother lying on the floor too weak to rise, her two dead and naked children covered with slush and mud lying by her side. End quote. Blending life and death in one family scene, tragically and emotionally written by Jonathan Spence there. And while it's not the type of thing that you probably want to think about, it paints a scene that is important to remember about the Taiping Civil War. And that is that the suffering and the misery of millions, tens of millions of people shouldn't be forgotten, and it continues to have ripple effects even to this day. By the end of 1864, Nanjing had been surrounded. What was left of its inhabitants were either fleeing the city or starving to death. Hong Xiuquan, the leader of this Taiping movement, in typical Hong fashion, is proclaiming that they are invincible and that God will save them. However, he gets sick and dies. Zheng Guofan and the Qing armies surround Nanjing, breach the walls, slaughter about 10 to 20,000 people, round up the leadership of the Taiping movement, and within a few short months, just like that, the Taiping Civil War was over. There are many big picture questions to be asked in the aftermath of the Taiping Civil War. The Qing dynasty is preserved, for the moment at least. The established moral and philosophical order of China is maintained, again, for the moment. Some historians see the Qing dynasty winning as merely sort of kicking the can down the road. There's going to be a 1911 nationalist revolution that in some ways continues settling these big questions of ideology and nationalism and anti-establishment viewpoints. Many people see the Taiping movement as a whole as something that was crushed, but actually has a sort of spiritual successor that rears its head a century later during the Chinese Civil War of the 20th century, and ultimately the creation of what we would call communist China today. The British preserved their imperial and trading and economic interests. Counterfactual historians have wondered what would have happened in the very real event that the Taiping won this war. How would the 20th century have played out any differently? But while you can ask all of these big picture questions, and you rightly should, and they're interesting to ask, where this podcast is going next is how did ordinary people in China pick up the pieces after this disastrous civil war? How do you psychologically and emotionally and spiritually recover from such a devastating event? And maybe simply logistically, how do you rebuild the world around you after the totally devastating brutality and nature of this war that we've talked about so far in this podcast series? What were the real life implications of the massive tragedy that was the Taiping Civil War?